Platinum Kryptonite, a rare kryptonite that could give a human Kryptonian abilities under the yellow sun. Let us see what will happen when Naruto Uzumaki as a child becomes one of the most powerfulest person in his entire planet. So sit back, relax, and enjoy, guys.
What if Naruto found Platinum Kryptonite? Space does not care about borders. It does not care about hidden villages or cage or the careful political arrangements that keep nations from destroying each other. Space is simply vast and old, and occasionally it drops things into the world without explanation or apology. On a Tuesday night in October, when Naruto Uzumaki was 7 years old and had fallen asleep at his desk with his cheek on a bowl of leftover ramen, something fell out of the sky above Fire Country. It entered the atmosphere as a streak of white light that 3 separate Jonin on night patrol saw and reported as a possible enemy signal flare. It was not a signal flare. It passed over the village walls without slowing and hit the forest floor 2 kilometers northeast of Konoha with a sound like a thunderclap and a flash that briefly turned midnight into noon. By the time anyone investigated the next morning, there was a crater in the forest floor about 3 meters wide, and at the center of it, still faintly warm, was a rock. Not an ordinary rock. It was white, but not the white of chalk or limestone. It was the white of something that had been traveling through starlight for so long that starlight had become part of its composition. It glowed very faintly at its edges, a pulse that was almost biological, almost like breathing, and it was the most beautiful thing Naruto Uzumaki had ever seen. He had found the crater at dawn because he woke up early most mornings when the nightmares chased him out of sleep, and the forest was the one place in the world that did not look at him with distrust. He had followed the light the same way children follow anything that shines in the dark, without strategy, without thinking. He reached into the crater and picked it up with both hands. What happened next took less than 3 seconds and rearranged everything. It was not painful. That was the first thing. He had expected pain because most things in his life that changed him had hurt first. This was the opposite of pain. It was warmth that started in his palms and moved up his arms and filled his chest and then his entire body all the way to the ends of his fingers and the soles of his feet, and then it went deeper than his body, deeper than anything physical, and rearranged something at the level of what he was made of. The rock crumbled to dust in his hands. Naruto stood in the crater in the early morning forest and breathed and felt different and did not yet know how. He walked home and fell asleep at his desk again and did not dream. His alarm clock went off at 7 in the morning and he reached over without looking and his hand went through it. Not around it, through it. The clock exploded sideways into the wall in a shower of springs and glass, and Naruto sat up and looked at his hand, and his hand was fine. No cuts, no bruises. The wall had a new hole in it shaped roughly like an alarm clock. He stared at it for a long time. Then he got up and got dressed and went to the academy. He broke his chair by sitting in it. He did not sit heavily. He sat the way he always sat, dropping down without thinking, and the chair simply came apart beneath him, every joint giving way at once. The class laughed. Iruka-sensei started to say something about being more careful and then stopped because Naruto was holding the 2 pieces of the chair back together and they were not going back together because the wood had not bent or cracked. It had compressed, as though something had hit it with enormous force. Iruka asked Naruto to stay after class. Naruto spent the rest of the morning trying to be careful, and careful was suddenly the hardest thing in the world. Every pencil he touched snapped. He opened his textbook and tore the cover off. He raised his hand to answer a question and knocked his desk forward 2 meters. He sat completely still and focused on not touching anything, and it was the most exhausting thing he had ever done. By noon word had reached the Hokage. Hiruzen Sarutobi sat across from a 7-year-old boy who had accidentally destroyed 4 pieces of furniture, 2 doorknobs, a section of hallway railing, and 1 very unfortunate potted plant on his way into the Hokage Tower, and looked at him with the expression of a man revising everything he thought he understood. He asked Naruto what had happened. Naruto told him about the crater and the white rock and the warmth. He told it plainly, the way children tell things before they learn to be strategic about information, and hear as in listen to every word. Then Hiruzen called in his most trusted medical nin and his most trusted researchers, and for 2 weeks they ran tests. The tests confirmed what every broken piece of furniture had already suggested. Naruto was strong, not shinobi strong, not even tailed beast strong. The measurement equipment broke before they reached his upper limit, and they had to stop measuring and simply accept that the number was beyond their instruments. His skin could not be cut. His bones could not be broken. He healed from the one serious attempt at harm, a high-level fire jutsu administered with full consent in a controlled environment, in under 4 seconds, and the burns that should have covered his arm were gone before they could be photographed. He was also faster than anyone could reliably track after the first week. And on the 5th day of testing, Naruto had jumped straight up to see if he could reach the ceiling and had not come back down for 45 seconds. He could fly. Hiruzen sat in his chair that evening and looked at the test results and thought about the 9 tails sealed inside this boy and thought about Minato and Kushina and thought about what it meant that the universe had chosen this specific child to give this specific gift to, and felt something that was either wonder or terror and might have been both. He told the researchers to keep the results classified. He did not tell them this would be impossible. Word got out the way word always gets out, not through official channels but through human ones. Someone saw Naruto running along the top of the wall at a speed that should not have been possible. Someone else saw him catch a falling civilian from 3 stories up without flinching. A child told another child who told their parent, and by the time Naruto was 8 years old, half of Konoha had a story. Some of those stories were told in fear. The council convened twice to discuss what Naruto represented as a military asset. They used that word, acid. The same men who had voted to ensure he was isolated and alone now sat around a table and calculated what he was worth to the village, and Hiruzen listened and kept his face neutral and said he would take their concerns under advisement. He took none of their actions under advisement. What he did was watch Naruto. And what he saw when he watched Naruto was a boy who was trying very hard to be normal and finding normal increasingly difficult. Naruto learned control the way anyone learns anything, through repetition and failure and getting back up. He spent months learning how to shake hands without breaking fingers. He learned to walk slowly in crowds. He learned to measure his voice because he had discovered at 8.5 that if he shouted at full volume the windows cracked. He was lonely in the specific way that someone becomes lonely when they are different from everyone around them and cannot explain the difference. But he was also, for the first time in his life, not afraid. Nothing could hurt him. This was not arrogance. He tested it carefully and thoroughly, and it was simply true. The thing that had happened to him in the crater had removed the physical vulnerability that every living thing carried, and without that vulnerability the world felt fundamentally different. He could walk into any room. He could face any person. He could stand in front of the council members who looked at him like an equation and look back without flinching. He was 7 years old when he found the stone, and by the time he was 9 he stood differently than any 9-year-old in the village. At 10 years old he started hearing things. Not whispers, not secrets, everything. He heard a woman crying 3 streets away at 2 in the morning, quietly, the kind of crying designed not to be heard, the kind that meant she had been doing it long enough to learn how to make it small. He heard a man in the merchant district telling his son that he was worthless in a voice too low for neighbors to catch. He heard children in the orphanage at the edge of the village calling out in their sleep and receiving no answer. He heard all of it all the time. It did not stop. He started going to the places where the sounds came from. He left food. He sat outside the orphanage until the nightmares quieted. He stood outside the merchant's shop the next morning and looked at the man until the man became uncomfortable and went inside. He did not announce himself. He did not explain. He just responded to what he heard because not responding became impossible. Hiruzen found out about this too. He found out because a woman came to the Hokage Tower and said that the Uzumaki boy had left a week's worth of groceries on her doorstep 4 times in a row, and she wanted to know if she should be concerned, and Hiruzen had said nah, not at all, and then sat very still after she left. He called Naruto in. Naruto sat across from him and Hiruzen asked him what he was hearing. Naruto told him everything, the scope of it, the range, that it had been growing steadily for 2 years and was now essentially constant, and that he could choose to focus it or unfocus it the way you choose to focus your eyes, but that unfocusing it did not make it go away. That every night he lay in his apartment and heard Konoha, all of it, every sound every person made, and that most of those sounds were fine, but enough of them were not fine that sleeping was difficult. Hiruzen asked him how he was managing. Naruto said, I go to the ones who need it. Hiruzen said, you cannot save everyone, Naruto. Naruto said, I know. I am trying to save the ones I can reach. By the time Naruto was 11, the list of things he could do had grown. He could see through walls. He could see for kilometers, farther if he climbed high enough, and with a focus that made the finest telescope in the land of fire look approximate. He could generate heat from his eyes that could melt stone. He could move faster than the eye could track, and fast enough that he occasionally arrived somewhere before he had consciously decided to go there. He got stronger every day he spent in sunlight. and he had discovered this by accident during a summer training session where he had noticed that after an hour in direct sunlight he felt different. Fuller, more complete, he had spent 3 days testing this systematically and confirmed it beyond any doubt. The sun fed him, he did not know why. He accepted it the way he accepted all of it, as the reality of what he was now. He was the loudest and most powerful thing in the land of fire, and he walked through the academy halls in a too small orange jacket with paint stains on the sleeve and ate alone at lunch because none of his classmates knew how to sit next to him without feeling the size of the difference. Except Shikamaru, who sat next to him occasionally, specifically because Shikamaru was too lazy to calculate whether or not it was socially complicated, and who told him once with total flatness that he was the most troublesome person alive, and Naruto had laughed so hard he accidentally dented the lunch table. The night Naruto decided to leave, he was 12 years old and he had been hearing a village burn for 6 hours. It was a civilian settlement 3 days east of Konoha, outside Fire Country's formal protection, and a warlord's forces had moved through it, and what they were doing there Naruto could hear in the voices of the people and could not unhear and could not stop hearing. He went to Hiruzen at midnight. He stood in the Hokage's office and said, "I need to go." Hiruzen was awake because Hiruzen was always awake, the burden of leadership being incompatible with consistent sleep, and he looked at the 12-year-old standing in his office and said, "Go where?" Naruto said, "Out there, beyond the walls. The world is much larger than this village, and the sounds I hear from it are not all right, and I am the only thing that can do something about it." Hiruzen said, "You are a child." Naruto said, "I am a child who cannot be harmed, cannot be stopped, can fly, and can hear suffering from kilometers away." He paused. He said, "I am not your enemy, old man. I am not leaving because I am angry. I am leaving because I hear things you cannot hear, and it would be wrong to stay comfortable inside these walls while those things are happening." Hiruzen tried. He talked about duty to the village and about being too young and about the political complications of an unaffiliated entity operating outside national borders. He made good arguments. He made them with genuine feeling. Naruto listened to all of them. Then he said, "When I was 7 years old, I used to sit on the floor of my apartment and listen to the village outside and hope that someone would knock on my door. Nobody ever knocked. I know what it sounds like when someone needs someone to come. I have been hearing it every night for 2 years from people who are much further away than a door." He walked to the window. He said, "I will come back. This is my home, but the world is larger." He stepped out of the window and flew east. 3 years is a long time when you are growing up and a short time when you are watching history. Naruto was 12 when he left and 15 when the world gave him a name. In those 3 years, he dismantled 2 private armies that had been operating in the borderlands between nations. He redirected a flood that would have destroyed a river delta and 50,000 people. He pulled a ship out of a storm system that had already taken 3 vessels down that season. He walked into a compound where 40 civilians were being held and walked out with 40 civilians and left the compound in a condition that required its owners to rebuild it from the foundation. He did not announce himself. He did not make speeches. He showed up where the sounds led him and did what needed doing and left. But people saw, people always see. The first name came from a fishing village on the coast where a 15-year-old boy in a battered orange jacket had pulled their entire fleet out of a Category 3 storm system with his hands. They called him the Golden Boy. That name did not travel far. The name that traveled was Superboy. It came from a journalist in a port city who had seen him land in the middle of a market under attack and end the attack in under 2 minutes and had described him in print as a Superboy from nowhere, and the name caught because it was accurate enough and memorable enough and because people needed something to call the thing they were seeing. He was 15 and he was still in the orange jacket and he had not decided yet what he was. He was just responding to the sounds. Jiraiya found him on a rooftop in the land of water. Naruto heard him coming from 2 kilometers away, recognized the chakra signature from stories Hiruzen had told him, and was sitting cross-legged on the rooftop waiting when the Toad Sage landed. Jiraiya looked at him for a long moment and said, "You are exactly like your father except somehow louder." Naruto said, "You knew my father." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and covered everything. Minato Namikaze, the 4th Hokage, Kushina Uzumaki, the red-haired storm, the Knight of the Nine Tails attack and the seal and the sacrifice. All of it that Naruto had not been told, delivered on a rooftop in the land of water by a man who was crying in the specific way that men who refuse to cry look when they cannot help it. Naruto sat with all of it. He asked about the Uzumaki clan. Jiraiya told him what he knew. The Whirlpool Village, the sealing specialists, the spiral symbol that was their heritage and had been placed on his stomach by his father as the seal that held the 9 tails. Naruto pulled up his jacket and looked at the seal and thought about his mother and his father and the symbol that was already on every piece of equipment he owned without him knowing why he had always been drawn to it. He put the jacket down. He said, "I want a suit. Something that lasts." Jiraiya spent 6 weeks working on it. Funjutsu layered over funjutsu, seal over seal, materials sourced from 6 different nations and woven together with techniques that had not been used in 2 generations. The result was something that looked like intention rather than armor. Dark material with structure to it, a hood that could be raised or lowered, and on the chest, placed there by Naruto's own hand, an Uzumaki spiral in white. Not the Konoha leaf, the Uzumaki spiral, the symbol of what he came from. Jiraiya looked at it when it was done and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother would have cried and pretended she was not crying, and your father would have cried and not pretended." Naruto put the suit on and flew straight up into the sky, and the sun hit the spiral on his chest, and Jiraiya, watching from the rooftop, thought that some things were too large for the category of ordinary events and needed to simply be witnessed. He was Superman to the world by the time he was 18. Not because anyone declared it, because Superboy had grown and the world had watched him grow and the name grew with him. He stopped conflicts that would have become wars. He walked into rooms where men with power were making decisions about people without power and changed the nature of those decisions through his presence alone, without violence, without threat, simply by being there and being what he was. He was not naive. He did not think presence was always enough. When it was not enough, he acted. He killed people. He had made this decision with full awareness and had thought about it more carefully than he had thought about almost anything. There were people whose continued existence was a guarantee of other people's deaths. He did not decide this lightly or often. He decided it precisely and carried the weight of it without distributing it to anyone else. Each face was a face he kept. The world was complicated about him. Nations that benefited from his interventions quietly drafted policies that would allow them to request his help without formally acknowledging that they needed it. Nations that he had stopped were less quiet about their feelings. There was a coalition of 5 border lords who had put a collective bounty on him that was large enough to buy a small country, and whom Naruto had heard discussing this from 800 kilometers away while eating breakfast, and who had sighed and continued eating. He was 18 and the world was his context. He needed somewhere to be a person in. Her name was Mika. She sold books from a cart in a market in the capital city of Fire Country, a city large enough that the famous and the powerful passed through it regularly, and the residents had developed the practiced indifference of people who have stopped being impressed. She had dark eyes and she kept a pencil behind her ear, and she had opinions about books that she shared without being asked because she felt strongly that people making poor reading choices was a preventable problem. Naruto landed on the street 30 meters from her cart because he had heard a child fall from a balcony above the market and caught the child and set the child down and turned to find the parent and found instead Mika standing in front of him with her arms crossed in an expression that was not awe. She said, "You dropped the book." He looked at his hands. In the motion of catching the child, he had apparently also caught a book that had fallen from the balcony with the child and then set the child down and dropped the book. He picked it up and looked at the cover and handed it to her and said, "Sorry." She looked at the book and said, "It is not mine. It is hers." She nodded at the child's mother, who was now making her way down the stairs with an expression of a person who had aged 10 years and 30 seconds. Naruto handed the book to the mother and looked back at Mika. She had already turned back to her card and was reorganized in a stack of novels with the focus of someone who had somewhere to be. He said, "Are you not going to say anything?" She said, "About what?" He said, "I just caught a child falling from a balcony." She said, "Yes, I saw." She pulled a novel from the stack and examined its spine and put it back. She said, "Were you expecting applause, or?" He looked at her for a long moment and then laughed. Not a polite laugh, a real one, sudden and genuine and a little startled, the way laughter sounds when it was not planned. She looked at him then, a real look, assessing rather than impressed, and she said, "You look hungry. There is a noodle cart 3 stalls down. Tomoya makes a good broth." She went back to her books. He went to the noodle cart, and when he came back with 2 bowls, she was not surprised to see him, which was itself surprising. And they ate noodles on the curb next to her book cart in the middle of the market, and she told him exactly what was wrong with the last 3 popular novels in the capital, and he listened and asked questions, and she answered them with the thoroughness of someone who had been waiting for someone who asked real questions. He came back the next day, and the day after. Mika was the daughter of a retired cartographer and a woman who repaired instruments for musicians. She had grown up in a house full of maps and music and books and had decided at age 9 that books were the most useful because they contained maps of places that did not exist yet and music for feelings that had not been named. She had strong opinions about soup, about the architectural failures of the capital's newer buildings, and about the specific kind of person who dog-eared pages, which she considered a moral failing rather than a preference. She was not impressed by power. She had explained this to Naruto on their 4th meeting when he had arrived at her cart having just returned from preventing what would have been a significant military incident 3 countries away and still had dust on his suit, and she had handed him a book and said, "You look like you need to sit down," and he had said, "I just stopped a war," and she had said, "Good, now sit down." He sat down. She said, "Do you want to talk about it or do you want to read?" He said, "What is the book about?" She said, "A man who builds a lighthouse because he cannot make people stop drowning, so he decides at least he can make the dark less dark." He sat with that for a moment. He said, "That is a good book to give someone." She said, "I know what books to give people. It is what I do." He read 3 pages and told her about the war that almost happened, and she listened the way she did everything, fully and without theater, and asked one question at the end that reframed the entire situation in a way that he had not considered, and he looked at her and thought that intelligence was the most interesting thing about a person and that she had more of it than almost anyone he had met. He was 18, she was 19. He came back every time the world let him. The Akatsuki had been watching Naruto since the news of him reached Pain's network. Pain was methodical. He did not act on incomplete information. He spent 2 years collecting complete information, which took longer than usual because the information kept expanding. Every time his operatives reported a new capability or a new incident, the report became larger and more difficult to categorize. He sent Conan to observe directly. Conan watched Naruto for 2 weeks and came back and told Pain everything. The suit, the speed, the strength, the way jutsu did not work on him, the solar absorption, the girl at the book cart who made him laugh. Pain sat with all of it and made a decision. He did not send 2 operatives. He sent everyone. The attack came on a morning in late spring when Naruto was 19 and Mika was at her cart and the market was full. They came from 6 directions, coordinated, specific. Naruto heard them before they arrived, heard the chakra signatures converging from the rooftops, and he moved. The Darta's explosions hit him directly and he flew through them and came out the other side, and they tried again and he let them because stopping them fast required moving through the crowd and he was not going to move through the crowd at full speed. He moved them away from the market first. He drew them out deliberately, let himself be the target, flew up and out over the city, and they followed because that was the intent and he was not subtle about it. Over open ground he stopped pulling his speed. What followed was not a fight in the traditional sense. A fight implies 2 forces of comparable capability. This was something else. Deidara's explosions, Sasori's puppets, Hidan's ritual, Kikuzu's techniques, all of it arriving on a single target who healed from anything that found a way to make contact in seconds and could not be slowed and could not be bound and moved through every barrier they constructed. He was not cruel about it. He was efficient. Each one was stopped in the minimum way necessary and left in a condition that ended their involvement. Itachi watched from a distance and did not engage. Naruto saw him watching and noted it and set it aside. Pain arrived last. He landed 30 meters from Naruto over the empty field outside the city and looked at him with the Rinnegan, and Naruto looked back. Pain said, "You cannot save the world. You can save people in it, for a time, but the world itself produces suffering from its own structure and you cannot change the structure." Naruto said, "I know." Pain said, "Then what are you doing?" Naruto said, "The same thing as you. Trying to make something better." He paused. He said, "The difference is that you have decided the method matters less than the result, and I think the method is the result. What you make people feel on the way to the future you are building is the future you are building." Pain was quiet. Naruto said, "You lost someone. That is what this is. Someone you loved, and the losing of them convinced you that love was the problem, that attachment was the weakness." He said, "I understand that. I spent my whole childhood without anyone, and I thought for a long time that having no one was its own kind of safety. Then someone sat next to me on a curb and shared a bowl of noodles and gave me a book about a lighthouse, and I understood that what I had been calling safety was just a smaller kind of suffering." Pain stood in the field. Naruto said, "Stop. Whatever the next phase of this is, stop it. Not because I will stop you, although I will. Because the thing you are trying to build will not hold. It cannot. You cannot make people feel pain deeply enough to stop causing it. You can only show them something different." The field was quiet. Pain said, "You are very certain for someone so young." Naruto said, I have been flying over this world for 7 years and hearing it in the dark. I am certain about very little. I am certain about this. Nagato withdrew. Naruto watched him go and did not follow. Nika asked him that evening what had happened, and he told her, and she listened and then was quiet for a moment and said, "Do you think he will stop?" Naruto said, "I think he is tired. I think he has been tired for a long time and had nowhere to put the tiredness." She said, "That is a generous way to read someone who just tried to destroy you." He said, "Generous is not the same as wrong." She looked at him in the way she looked at him sometimes, full attention, no performance, and said, "You know you are unusual." He said, "I am aware." She said, "Not the flying. The other part, the way you read people." He said, "I hear a lot of people. It gives you a picture eventually." She said, "Come here." He came and she put her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her and they sat in her small apartment above the book cart with the window open and the city sounds coming in, and he listened to all of it, every sound. And for the first time in memory, the sounds were not heavy. They came when Naruto was 23. He heard them before any sensor in the world did. Heard the distortion in the upper atmosphere, heard something that sounded like dimensional compression, and he was already flying up before the arrival point finished forming. Momoshiki Otsutsuki and Kinshiki arrived in the upper atmosphere over Fire Country in a descent that left visual trails across the sky visible from 3 nations. They were here for chakra. They were here specifically because their sensors had detected an anomaly, a being on the surface of this planet with a chakra signature that did not match anything in their catalog data. They found Naruto at 20,000 meters. Kinshiki attacked immediately. Naruto felt the strike, and it was the first strike in his adult life that he actually felt, that actually registered as force rather than nothing, and he recalibrated. These were not people. These were something else, something from further away than anything he had fought before. He fought Kinshiki for 11 minutes and destroyed him in the 12th. Momoshiki watched and absorbed and attacked with the absorbed power, and what followed was 17 minutes that Naruto would not describe to Mika in detail, because the detail was not the point. The point was that it ended. Momoshiki went the way of Kinshiki, completely and without remainder, and Naruto returned to the surface with bruises that had already healed and an understanding that the universe was larger than he had calculated. Others came over the following 2 years. Smaller in power, not in ambition, each drawn by the same anomaly, the same impossible signal from the surface of a planet that should not have produced a being of his nature. He destroyed them or turned them back. He learned from each encounter. His understanding of what he was fighting expanded, and then the signal came that was different from all the others. His name was Asuran, king of the Otsutsuki, not a title of inheritance, a title of conquest, held by the being who had defeated every challenger across every dimension the clan had touched in 10,000 years. He was older than most civilizations and had the presence of something that had watched stars form and collapse and had not been impressed. Naruto heard him coming from 2 days out and spent those 2 days with Mika. He told her what was coming. He told her everything he knew and everything he did not know, and she listened to all of it and then made tea and handed him a cup and said, "Are you afraid?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Good. Fear means you understand what is at stake." He said, "I need you to go somewhere safe." She said, "I am going to the village. I know people there." He said, "Konoha." She said, "You always call it the village. Like there is only one." He said, "For me there is only one." She crossed the room and held his face in her hands the way she had learned to do when she needed him to be fully present and said, "You come back." He said, "I intend to." She said, "Intending is not the same as committing." He said, "I commit." She kissed him and he held her, and then she pulled back and looked at him with the full attention look and said, "You know you are the most impossible person and I chose you anyway." He said, "I know. I am grateful every day." She let him go. Asuran arrived not from the sky but from a dimensional fold that opened in the air above the ocean west of Fire Country. He stepped through it and closed it behind him and stood on the air and looked at the planet with the mild interest of someone arriving at a destination they had been to hundreds of times. He was tall, white-haired, with markings on his face that were not tattoos but something older, patterns that moved if you looked at them from the side. His eyes were silver, fully silver, no iris distinction. The eyes of something that had processed more light than a human eye was built to process. He wore no armor. He did not need armor. He looked at Naruto and said, "You are the anomaly." Naruto said, "I have been called worse." Asuran said, "Your planet produced something that should not exist. We have been coming here to correct this for 2 years and you have destroyed every team I sent." He said it without anger. It was a status report. Naruto said, "I am aware." Asuran said, I am not here to destroy you. I am here to evaluate you. If you are what you appear to be, you belong with us, not here. Naruto said, I belong here. Asuran said, you are not from here. What you are now is not something this planet made. The stone that changed you is ours. It passed through our territory for 10,000 years before it fell here. You are, in effect, our creation. Naruto said, I am Naruto Uzumaki, son of Minato Namikaze and Kushina Uzumaki. From Konoha, I was made by everything that happened to me in this world. The stone gave me abilities. It did not give me who I am. Asuran looked at him for a moment. Then he attacked. The first strike hit Naruto like a planet hitting a wall. He felt himself moving backward and processed that he was moving at high speed and corrected after approximately 1 kilometer. He turned around and looked at Asuran across the distance between them and understood that the recalibration he had done for Momoshiki had to happen again, further and faster. Asuran was faster than Momoshiki, considerably, and the techniques he used were not jutsu, not chakra in any form Naruto recognized, but something native to wherever the Otsutsuki came from originally, something dimensional, something that interacted with reality at a level below chakra. The fight moved out over the ocean and into the upper atmosphere and back. Naruto was not losing exactly. He was not winning exactly either. He was matching, which for a being of Asuran's caliber was more than should have been possible, and he knew it and Asuran knew it, and Naruto could see in Asuran's movements a quality that might have been surprise. But matching was not enough. He needed more. He had known this moment might come. He had thought about it on the rooftops of a dozen cities and in the air over a dozen conflicts, and once, quietly, at Mika's kitchen table when she was asleep and he was watching the night through the window. He flew up, not away, not retreating. He flew up with full intention, straight toward the sun, and Asuran stopped pursuing after 10,000 meters because the heat output at that altitude it was not survivable by conventional means. He watched Naruto continue upward until Naruto was a point of light against the sun's face and then, briefly, not distinguishable from it. Naruto entered the corona. The sun did not burn him. The sun fed him. He had known this since he was 11 years old, had tested it carefully, had learned the geometry of it. The way the solar energy was not just warmth but information, the star's own output pouring into him and filling whatever reservoir the Platinum Kryptonite had opened inside him at the cellular level. On the surface of the Earth he absorbed the filtered version, the light that had passed through the atmosphere and lost most of its intensity. Here there was no filter. He flew into it completely and let it fill him entirely, and the sensation was not like power exactly. It was like remembering the largest version of yourself after a long time of being smaller. He stayed until he was full. Then he came back. Asuran saw him returning from 1,200 kilometers away and calculated the energy output and made a series of rapid assessments. Naruto's body was glowing, the solar energy rapidly moving around him, his entire body glowing as he had dipped into the sun. Asuran released everything, but Naruto did not stop. Asuran flew into the sky trying to get away, but Naruto's speed was beyond him. He turned mid-air. He used every ability that he's gained, every ability that he's created, everything in his catalog, but Naruto flew through it all as he pulled his fist back. Naruto pushed his power into the fist and hit him. The sky lit up like the sun and exploded. A wave went over the entire elemental nation as Naruto's fist had completely blown him to sunderers, and with that Naruto had eradicated the Otsutsuki clan, wiping away the head, destroying everything that was left. Naruto fell. He fell and crashed down hard. He had used the power that he got from the sun in that blow and destroyed his enemy. As he lied there in the ground, he felt even stronger than before. It was almost like dipping into the sun caused his power to reach a new level of growth, and it was growing even higher. He got to his feet feeling energized. He had to go home. Then he flew home. Home was the capital city and a small apartment above a book cart where a woman with dark eyes and strong opinions about soup was sitting on the floor with a book in her lap and looked up when he came through the window and said, "Well." He said, "It is done." She said, "Sit down then." He sat on the floor beside her and she put her book down and leaned against him, and he leaned back and he heard the city around them, all of it, every sound, the ordinary texture of people living their lives. He said, "I committed. I came back." She said, "I noticed." She picked her book back up. He looked at the wall. Outside the city made its sounds and the sun was going down and the light came through the window at an angle that made everything warm. He was 23 years old and the world was still here. Beyond the world, in the space between what was and what had always been, the platinum stone that had crumbled in a 7-year-old's hands was not gone. It had only changed form. The material it had been made of was not a substance, but a question, concentrated and made physical over 10,000 years of intention, left in a forest outside a village by forces that operated on timescales that made the history of the hidden villages feel like an afternoon. The question had been the same one Asuran had named above the ocean. They had watched the boy find it and touch it and change. They had watched him fly and fight and hear the world and responded. They had watched him meet a girl over a drop book and choose her as deliberately as he chose anything, which was completely. They had watched him go into the sun and come back with the answer. They had their data, not power, not technique, not the strength of the body or the reach of the senses. What held was what had always held, the thing that had no mass and could not be measured and could not be taken. He had been lonely once, completely, and he had let someone in, and that had been the foundation everything else was built on. The question was whether the greatest power in a world could be carried by a human heart without destroying it. The answer was in an apartment above a book cart. The answer was yes. The end.
That's it. Plenty more to come. I'm out for now. Peace, guys.